Chapter 1. The letter from Elderly Manor. The fog clung thickly to the panes of 221B Baker Street that morning, muffling the city's usual din and cloaking London in a pale shroud of silence. Dr. John H. Watson had just set aside the morning papers whose headlines were more preoccupied with Parliament squabbles than anything of real human interest when Sherlock Holmes broke the hush. "A curious seal, don't you think, Watson?" he said, holding aloft a thick envelope with a flourish. The parchment was of fine quality, the crest upon the wax unmistakably noble. A woman's profile in a laurel circle, unfamiliar to me, though clearly belonging to a house of some antiquity. Holmes had already slit it open with his penknife, his pale fingers unfolding the letter with care. "It is from a Lord Rupert Alderley of Dorsetshire," Holmes remarked, skimming the contents with quick eyes. "He requests my presence at once. The matter, he claims, is not one for the police, but, as he delicately puts it, for the logical eye of the consulting mind." "Rather vague," I offered, pouring tea. "Deliciously so," Holmes said, already rising to don his overcoat. "It is precisely the sort of vagueness that promises substance underneath." "Does he mention the nature of the problem?" Holmes shook his head. "Only that it concerns a family heirloom, one that watches in silence." He raised a brow. "Come, Watson. The game, as they say, is quietly afoot." The journey to Elderly Manor took the better part of the day by train and carriage. By late afternoon, the air had taken on the brittle chill of early November, and the countryside had given way to misty hedgerows and crumbling stone walls. Elderly Manor revealed itself at the end of a winding lane, a gray, ivy-clad estate with turrets, chimneys, and shuttered windows like blind eyes overlooking the moors. Tall, thin man greeted us at the threshold. His hair was silver, his jaw firm, the lines of worry etched deeply into his brow. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I am Rupert Alderley. I thank you for coming." Holmes extended a gloved hand. "You mentioned an heirloom, my lord." "I did." Lord Alderley led us through the stone-floored halls of the manor, candlelight flickering in wall sconces. "It concerns a portrait of my late wife, Eleanor, painted nearly 10 years ago. Beautiful work, but ... He paused as we reached a long, high-ceilinged gallery. The room was lined with the ancestral visages of the Alderley family. High foreheads, cold eyes, and painted lace. At the far end stood a single frame covered with a dark velvet cloth. Holmes stepped closer. "Might we see it?" Lord Alderley nodded grimly. "Prepare yourselves. It is not what it was." With trembling hands, he drew the cloth away. The portrait revealed a woman in a pale blue dress, seated at a harpsichord, her expression serene. The light caught her auburn hair and the delicate arch of her brows, but it was the eyes that arrested. U.S. both so lifelike, so piercing, one could almost believe they saw. Holmes was silent for a long moment. "She watches us," Lord Alderley said finally. "And not merely in the sense of a well-executed painting. I mean quite literally. Her gaze shifts. Each night it is different." "An illusion, surely," I said, uneasy despite myself. "That is what I thought," said Lord Alderley, "until my daughter, Margaret, came to me in tears 2 nights ago. She said the portrait followed her across the gallery." Holmes turned to our host. "Has anyone tampered with it? Restoration, adjustment, a hidden mechanism?" "None," Lord Alderley said. "The artist who painted it died 5 years ago, and the painting has not moved from this room in nearly a decade." Holmes leaned in, eyes narrowed. "And yet, something has changed." He took out a small magnifying lens and examined the corners of the canvas, the frame, and the backing. Then he stood back and took in the gallery's layout angles, shadows, and wall sconces before offering a low hum of interest. "You say this only occurs at night?" Lord Alderley nodded. "It begins after sundown. I've even taken to sleeping in the guest wing, as I find I cannot walk past this hall without the hairs on my neck rising." Holmes gave a faint smile. Then, my dear lord, we shall keep vigil tonight. Watson and I will observe the portrait ourselves. We were shown to a pair of well-furnished rooms in the Manor's East Wing. Holmes barely paused to unpack, instead spending the hours before dinner walking the house with quiet steps, examining doorways, measuring distances, even speaking briefly to the maid, a pale girl named Agnes who claimed to have heard whispering. Noises in the gallery after dusk-dotted supper. The family was sparse. Lord Alderley, his teenage daughter Margaret nervous and soft-spoken, and a cousin named Cedric. A stout man with a military mustache and a skeptical tone. "Forgive me," Cedric said brusquely, "but surely this is a case for an optician, not a detective." Holmes did not take offense. "On the contrary, sir. Illusions are often most potent when born not of optics, but of motive." Cedric frowned. What motive could a painting possibly have? Holmes sipped his wine. "It is not the painting I suspect, but the person or persons who stand to benefit from its unsettling presence." At precisely 9:30, Holmes and I returned to the gallery, cloaked in shadows. We took our positions. I sat upon a low velvet bench. Holmes stood just out of view of the portrait's eyes. The house had gone still. Only the wind beyond the tall windows disturbed the silence. The eyes of Lady Eleanor seemed to shimmer faintly in the candlelight. For nearly an hour, we waited. Then something subtle shifted. The play of shadow across her face changed, not from the candle, not from our movement. Holmes stepped closer, and so did I. Her gaze had impossibly moved. She stared not toward the center of the room, but slightly right toward the side gallery, where none of us had stood before. Holmes smiled faintly. "Watson," he said, "the portrait watches, but only because someone else is watching us through her." Chapter 2. The hidden panel. The silence in the portrait gallery deepened after Holmes' pronouncement, and I felt a familiar chill creep along my spine. Holmes stood poised, his head slightly inclined, his eyes fixed not on the portrait, but on the wall behind it. "There's something more to this, Watson," he said in a low tone. "Observe her gaze, not where it points, but what it avoids." We stepped cautiously toward the side wall. There was nothing immediately unusual about it, wood-paneled in the same dark oak as the rest of the gallery, lined with a thin border of age-worn plaster where frame met wall. Holmes ran his fingers lightly along the molding. Then, with a faint click, a narrow seam revealed itself beneath the edge of a sconce. "Ah," he murmured, "I thought as much." He pressed gently, and with a slow groan, a small section of the wall swung inward. Just wide enough for a man to pass through sideways. Behind the wall lay a narrow corridor, cloaked in utter darkness. "Bring the lamp," Holmes said. I retrieved the candle from its brass holder, shielding its flame as I followed him inside. The air smelled faintly of dust and something metallic. The corridor bent sharply after a few feet and led into a small chamber, barely large enough to stand in. At its center was a circular peephole positioned perfectly to overlook the portrait. From behind the canvas, Holmes examined it silently, then pointed. "Notice the hollow tubes built into the wall? A whisper in gallery. Stand here, and you can both see and speak into the room." He turned slowly, taking in the space with an analytical gleam in his eye. "Someone has been using this vantage point to watch the room, to manipulate belief, to manufacture the impossible. But who?" I asked. "That," Holmes said, "is precisely what we must uncover." Returning to the gallery, we found Lord Alderley waiting for us, pacing anxiously. "You were right," Holmes told him without delay. "There's a concealed passage behind the portrait, a perfect vantage for viewing the room. It is not the eyes of your late wife that watch, but those of the living." Lord Alderley turned pale. "Good God, but who would?" "That," Holmes interrupted, "depends greatly on who had access. How many individuals know of this passage?" The peer hesitated. "None living, as far as I was aware. It was designed In the time of my great-grandfather, a precaution during the Napoleonic years, when secret passages and escape routes were fashionable in houses of our ilk. And the only ones who reside here now? Holmes prompted. My daughter, Margaret, my cousin Cedric, and our housekeeper, Mrs. Briar. There's also young Agnes, the maid, and of course the groundsman, Paul, though he rarely enters the house. May I speak to them all tomorrow? Holmes asked. Certainly, said Lord Alderley, though he still looked unnerved. Then we shall begin at first light. That evening, as the household retired, Holmes and I lingered in the drawing room before the fire. I could see he was already constructing a mental map, piecing together lines of access and motive. There is more here than voyeurism, Watson, he mused. This elaborate ruse was constructed for a purpose. It required intent, timing, and the manipulation of fear. You saw how rattled Margaret was. She believed the eyes followed her. And yet she has nothing to gain from causing herself such distress. Exactly, Holmes agreed, which may exonerate her. But Cedric, I said, seems less unsettled. He scoffed at the notion. Yes, said Holmes. Too swiftly, I thought. Sometimes the greatest skeptics are those who seek to discredit truths before they emerge. The following morning, we met the members of the household in the small sitting room overlooking the west lawn. Holmes, ever methodical, began with Margaret. The girl was no older than 16, with chestnut hair and anxious eyes that darted toward every movement. She clutched a handkerchief as she sat. I didn't imagine it, she said in a near whisper. Her eyes, they weren't the same each day. I would walk down the gallery, and I felt it her watching me. Holmes nodded gently. And did you ever hear anything? A voice? A sound? Margaret's lips trembled. Once I thought I heard music, faint like humming, but no one else was nearby. Did you tell anyone? She hesitated. I told Agnes. She said I was just lonely. Did you notice anything unusual about the painting before this began? No, but Cedric ... She glanced at the door, then lowered her voice. He didn't like the portrait, said it was too lifelike. Sometimes I found him staring at it. Other times he wouldn't even go into the gallery. Holmes's eyes gleamed. With interest. Cedric, when summoned, arrived briskly, a cigar in one hand. Really, Mr. Holmes, I find this quite absurd. Ghosts in portraits? Secret passages? It smacks of Gothic melodrama. And yet the passage exists, Holmes said evenly. And the eyes did move. Trick of the light, Cedric insisted. You are a man of military bearing, Holmes observed, yet your nerves seem curiously frayed for one so rational. Cedric flushed. I don't care for foolishness, that's all. Holmes let the man go without further pressing, but I could see he had taken note. We interviewed Agnes next, the timid maid with pale eyes and calloused hands. I did hear whispering, she admitted nervously. Only once. I thought it was my imagination. Did anyone ask you to walk through the gallery at night? Her brows knit. No, sir. Did Margaret seem frightened? Oh, yes. She's been jumpy for days. And what of Cedric? She hesitated again. He's been strange. Sometimes I see him staring at the fire, muttering to himself. Holmes nodded slowly. The final interview was with Mrs. Briar, the housekeeper, stern, unsmiling, and efficient. I've run this house for 20 years. Mr. Holmes, the Elderleys are a proud line, but this business with the portrait, well, it's shaken us all. Do you recall anything being disturbed in the gallery? Nothing, sir, except perhaps, she frowned, the candlesticks. I noticed one was slightly off-center a few nights ago. Odd, as I straightened them myself. By late afternoon, Holmes and I were again alone in the study. Each piece fits, Watson, he said, steepling his fingers. We have a mechanism. We have an opportunity. What remains is the reason. What would someone gain by terrifying Margaret? By making her believe the dead still see? A ploy to drive her mad? Possibly. Or to drive her away. I felt a jolt of understanding. She is the sole heir, is she not? Holmes nodded. Lord Alderley is unwell. His eyes, I noticed, are poor. Should anything befall Margaret, Cedric inherits. Holmes gave a thin smile. Exactly. That evening, Holmes proposed a trap. We shall sit in the gallery once more, but this time we shall not be seen. He had observed that the angle of the mirror in the side hallway allowed a reflection of the secret peephole. If our phantom lurker returns, we shall know. At precisely 11 o'clock, we waited in silence, concealed behind the tall library doors adjacent to the gallery. The candles flickered. The portrait of Eleanor watched the room, UNMOVING. Then, at 20 past the hour, a soft creak, a sliver of motion behind the canvas. Holmes tapped my knee. Got you, he murmured. Chapter 3, The Man in the Wall. For several tense seconds, we remained absolutely still, eyes fixed on the reflection in the hallway mirror. The faintest shift behind the portrait, a glimmer of movement in the space, concealed by the hidden panel, was all we needed to confirm Holmes' theory. The intruder had returned. Holmes motioned silently. We crept from the shadows behind the library door and glided across the Persian rug, separated the study from the portrait gallery. With the lantern wick turned low, we approached the wall behind Eleanor Alderley's portrait. Holmes gestured for me to remain still while he pressed the concealed latch. With a sound no louder than the rustle of a curtain, the secret panel in the wall swung open. Holmes moved swiftly. A startled gasp followed by a scuffle echoed from the passage. I rushed forward with the lamp. Holmes had grasped the figure by the collar and wrestled them back into the gallery. The face that emerged from the darkness was not Cedric's, as we had suspected. It was the maid Agnes. Her pale face was drenched in sweat, her eyes wild with fright. Miss Margaret, she gasped. She's in danger. You must stop him. Who? Holmes demanded, his grip tightening. Agnes began to sob uncontrollably. He's going to hurt her. I tried to frighten her, to make her leave the house. I didn't know what else to do. Holmes' eyes narrowed. You mean the moving eyes, the whispering, those were your doing? Agnes nodded, trembling violently. Yes, the portrait, the noises. I used the whispering tube. I saw him enter the passage one night. I saw Mr. Cedric. He had papers in his hands. He thought no one would see. I kept watch. I thought if Miss Margaret got scared enough, she would beg her father to send her away. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. You went to great lengths to help her. I owed her, Agnes whispered. When my brother died last year, she gave me money, quietly, told no one. She's the only kind soul in this house. Holmes lowered her gently to the bench beneath the portrait. You were unwise, but not malicious. Still, you may have made things worse. She looked up at him, eyes wide. Worse? Holmes was already reaching for his coat. If Cedric suspects his plan has failed, he may act tonight. We found Margaret, alone in her bedchamber. The oil lamp on her knitstand flickered low, casting a pool of amber across her white nightdress. She looked up from the book in her lap, startled to see us. Mr. Holmes? You must come with us, Holmes said. Now, no questions. Too alarmed to argue, Margaret threw on her shawl, and we guided her swiftly through the servants. Holmes led us not outside, but down to the wine cellars below the east wind-shadowed vaults that smelled of damp stone and old oak. I need you to stay here, out of sight, he told her, and do not make a sound until I return. Margaret clutched her shawl. What's happening? I believe your cousin Cedric is attempting to remove you permanently. For your inheritance, she went pale. You must be wrong. Cedric, he wouldn't. Holmes did not wait for her to finish. He had already turned back toward the stairs. Upstairs, Holmes and I returned to the gallery. The hidden door had been left slightly ajar. Holmes gestured for me to draw my revolver. We entered. The narrow passage behind the portrait was empty. But on the far end, a second hidden latch had been tampered with. Holmes opened it cautiously, and we emerged into a forgotten study on the far side of the manor. Dust coated the shelves and desk. A locked drawer sat broken open. Holmes rifled through the papers. "Here," he said, holding out a series of documents with ornate seals. A revised will. It named Cedric as sole heir, dated a week ago, and unsigned. "And if Margaret were to die," I said grimly, "he could claim it was being processed." "Precisely. He's prepared his story." We moved quickly. It was nearly 2 in the morning when we found Cedric. He was in the west hallway, just outside Margaret's room, a candle in one hand and a small bottle in the other. Holmes stepped into view like a ghost. "A bit late for medication, isn't it, Mr. Alderley?" Cedric turned, startled. "What the devil?" "You won't find Margaret in her chamber," Holmes said calmly. "But you may have some explaining to do regarding this." He held up the revised will. Cedric's expression contorted. "You went through my private study?" "I did, and I found quite a tale, one I imagine the authorities will find rather compelling." With a sudden snarl, Cedric lunged. He struck the candle from Holmes' hand and dashed for the staircase. I pursued him while Holmes retrieved the fallen bottle. I could hear Cedric's boots pounding the steps ahead, but Holmes, ever precise, remained behind, studying the label. "Chloral hydrate," he muttered. I finally caught Cedric at the lower corridor and tackled him to the floor. By the time I dragged him back upstairs, Holmes was waiting with Lord Alderley, who had been roused from sleep. Margaret joined us shortly afterward, still pale but unharmed. The will was placed in the elder Lord Alderley's trembling hands. The bottle, too. He looked at Cedric for a long, painful moment. "You would poison your own kin?" he whispered. Cedric said nothing. Holmes turned to Margaret. "You are safe now, but I advise a thorough re-evaluation of the household's future." Later, as dawn broke over Alderley Grange, Holmes and I prepared to depart. Agnes stood quietly beside the carriage, twisting her hands. "She's to remain?" Holmes asked Margaret, nodding toward her. "Yes," said Margaret. "She was trying to help." Agnes burst into tears and embraced her. Holmes, ever impassive, stepped into the carriage. As we rolled down the gravel drive, I turned to him. "So it wasn't the ghost of Eleanor that haunted the house?" "No, Watson," he said, watching the light spill across the moor. "Only the ghosts of greed, guilt, and a conscience that tried, in its own way, to resist them." Chapter 4. The Ink in the Firelight. The morning following Cedric Alderley's failed scheme dawned over Alderley Grange with an uneasy hush. The mist from the moor had crept close to the house, blurring the boundaries between garden and field, as though nature itself conspired to keep the secrets that lingered in the house's cold stone walls. Margaret had retired at last, after a long and tearful conversation with her father. Though Cedric had not confessed outright, the combination of the forged will, the sedative, and Holmes's deductions had shaken Lord Alderley deeply. Whether through shame or disillusionment, he had fallen quiet, a shadow of the authoritative patriarch who had greeted us days before. We remained at the Grange, at Holmes's insistence, for he believed matters were not yet concluded. Cedric may have been the hand poised to strike, he said as we took tea in the drawing room, but I am not yet convinced he was the mind behind it. "You think someone else was involved?" I asked. Holmes nodded slowly, his gaze drawn toward the cold hearth. "There are threads here, Watson, loose ones." Cedric's plan was clumsy, even panicked. Yet the ghostly disturbances began weeks before. The portrait's eyes, the whispering voice, the tampered latch. These are not acts of desperation, but careful staging. But Agnes admitted to those. She admitted to some, not all. She feared for Margaret's safety, certainly. But there was another element in play, a deeper orchestration. Before I could inquire further, we were interrupted by the butler, Mr. Kilner, announcing that Lord Alderley had requested Holmes's presence in the study. The room had changed. Where once it had displayed the grand Assured hand of a landed nobleman, it now bore the aura of a man shaken. The heavy drapes were drawn open. A decanter of brandy sat untouched. Lord Aldurley stood at the window, his back to us. "You believe Cedric can help," he said without preamble. Holmes took a seat by the fire. "Yes, and I believe that help may lie closer to your ledger than your bloodline." Lord Alderley turned, his face grave. "My estate has enemies?" "Not enemies, opportunists. Those who see a family in decline and think to stake a claim, while the roof still stands. Might I examine your correspondence?" He hesitated, then nodded. "The drawer is unlocked." Holmes pulled open the desk drawer and began sorting through a pile of letters, bills, and estate notices. He set some aside in a neat stack. His fingers paused on one envelope, then slowly withdrew it. He examined the seal. "Interesting." He murmured, "Watson, do you recall the peculiar scent in the gallery behind the portrait? A trace of smoke, faint but acrid?" "I do, like old ink and burnt varnish." Holmes nodded, extracting a second letter. "And this one reeks of it. Someone burned a draft and sent another. The timing coincides with the portrait disturbances." He held the letter up to the light. A faint watermark of a local solicitor's office appeared. Holmes turned to Lord Alderley. "Did you recently revise your will, Lord Alderley?" "I considered it. Margaret's engagement fell through this spring. I wish to provide for her more directly. I instructed my solicitor to draft an amendment. Was Cedric aware of this?" "Only vaguely." "Then someone else, perhaps within your household, had both access to your mail and knowledge of your intentions." Holmes's eyes narrowed. He placed the letter near the firelight and gently warmed the parchment. Slowly, lines of faint ink bled into view, an overwritten message that had been concealed beneath fresh words. I leaned in. The original message, written in Lord Alderley's hand, had been altered. Holmes spoke softly. "This was intercepted and forged." "Good heavens," I muttered. "Indeed, this letter never reached its intended solicitor. Instead, it was manipulated to suggest that the old will should stand unchanged, and a new draft was never properly witnessed." Lord Alderley sank into his chair. "Who would do such a thing? That, my lord, is what I intend to discover." Later that day, Holmes requested to speak with the maid, Agnes, once more. She was hesitant, nervously wringing her apron. "I told you everything I knew," she whispered. "Perhaps," Holmes said gently, "but you might know more than you realize." He gestured to the hearth. "Did anyone else visit the portrait?" "Gallery at night." Agnes thought carefully. "Not that I saw, but—" She paused, then lowered her voice. "Mr. Ellison, the steward, he often wanders the halls after dark. He says he suffers from the gout, that it keeps him from sleeping. Did you ever see him in the east corridor?" "Twice, once near the portrait, another time by the back stairs." Holmes tapped his fingers together. "Thank you, Agnes. That will be all for now." That evening, Holmes invited the steward, Mr. Ellison, for a game of chess, a move I found most curious. The steward, a thin man with steel-rimmed spectacles and a permanent stoop, accepted graciously. We sat in the drawing room as the pieces moved slowly across the board. Holmes played absently, allowing his questions to wander far from the game. "You've been with the family long, Mr. Ellison?" "Since my youth, sir. My father served the previous lord. I remained on, as steward, a position of great trust." Ellison smiled modestly. "I hope I've never given cause for doubt. You manage the estate accounts, I gather?" "I do." "And the mail?" "For the master, yes, at times." Holmes leaned forward. "Would you be so kind as to fetch me the ledger for the household accounts last winter's, if possible?" Ellison blinked. "Now? If it's not too much trouble." The steward hesitated, then stood. "Very well, sir." The moment he left the room, Holmes was up. He strode to Ellison's chair and examined the man's pocket. From it, he drew a small blotting pad and a stub of sealing wax. He burned drafts, Holmes said, and rewrote them with practiced care. He found a matchbox tucked beneath the side table. He didn't count on the watermark. Ellison returned, ledger in hand, and stopped short when he saw Holmes standing beside his chair. Holmes said, "Nothing." He simply handed the steward the forged letter. "I imagine you used Lord Alderley's own wax in hand. Clever, but not clever enough." Ellison paled. You intercepted the revised will, suppressed it, and forged messages to the solicitor. Perhaps you feared the new arrangement would reduce your influence or your pension. I did nothing of the sort." Ellison sputtered. "You've no proof." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Shall we compare the blotting patterns?" The man went silent. Holmes turned to me. "Watson, be so good as to send for the constable." That night, as Holmes and I packed to leave Alderley Grange, Margaret came to bid us farewell. Her expression was sober, but grateful. "I can never repay you, Mr. Holmes," she said. He gave a polite nod. "Justice repays itself, Miss Alderley. One only needs to follow where the ink leads." She turned to me. "And you, Dr. Watson, will you write of this one?" "Perhaps," I said with a smile. "But I doubt anyone would believe it. A haunted portrait, a secret passage, and a steward with a talent for forgery." Her eyes sparkled for the first time in days. "Then it must be a true Holmes story." Chapter 5. The Hand Beneath the Floorboards. The following morning brought a stiff breeze off the moors, and the heavy scent of heather and whetstone. Holmes and I had packed our valises and were already in the process of bidding farewell to Ely Grange when a sudden and unexpected delay altered our departure. Lord Alderley himself had requested a final private word with Holmes in the library. "Owe you more than gratitude," the old man said as he lowered himself into the high-backed chair opposite Holmes. "But there is something else that has gnawed at me since last night." Holmes, who had been fastening the buttons of his gloves, paused. "Please continue." Lord Alderley gestured toward the far wall, where the bookshelves rose high, concealing decades of family secrets in leather-bound volumes. "After Mr. Ellison's arrest, I ordered the servants to air out the steward's quarters. This morning, Kilner discovered something lodged beneath the floorboards, an item wrapped in oilskin, deliberately hidden." Watson and I exchanged a glance. "You haven't opened it yet? I thought it best that you see it first." Holmes stood at once. "Show us." The steward's quarters, situated in the narrow north wing of the house, were functional and spare-worn rugs, a sagging bed, and a desk polished only where a hand had habitually rested. Kilner, the ever-stoic butler, awaited us, standing beside a loosened plank in the floor near the hearth. From the shallow cavity beneath, he retrieved a tightly bound bundle. The oilskin stained with age and soot. Holmes accepted it without a word and carefully unwrapped it atop the steward's desk. Inside was a small wooden box with a tarnished latch. He opened it. Within lay a glove, an old riding glove, leather worn thin and fingers slightly curled. Beneath it, folded twice and smudged at the edges, was a torn page of correspondence written in a tight, unfamiliar hand. Holmes read it aloud. "If the girl should persist, I recommend action be taken. Delay is dangerous. Your access to the Grange permits Opportunity Act before the portrait speaks again." The room fell still. Watson leaned forward. "The girl, Margaret?" "Almost certainly," Holmes murmured. "But note the curious phrase, before the portrait speaks again. What does that suggest? That someone knew of the portraits. Disturbances?" I offered, or more precisely, Holmes said, someone feared a secret connected to the portrait might be uncovered. This entire charade, the whispering voices, the moving eyes, the tampered gallery, was not merely a trick to scare Margaret. It was a smokescreen to prevent her from discovering something far more tangible. Watson frowned. But what secret could a portrait hold? Holmes turned to Kilner. "Has the portrait ever been altered?" "Not that I know of, sir. It's been there since Lord Edwin's time." Holmes closed the box and stood. Then, we must return to the gallery. At once, the portrait of Lady Evelyn Alderley hung in its proud and shadowed place, just as before. Sunlight filtered in through the tall windows, casting a golden shaft across her folded hands in steady gaze. There was no trace of menace now, only the stillness of a woman long past. Holmes examined the frame carefully, then turned his attention to the base of the wall just beneath it. He crouched, tapping the wood with his knuckles, listening. After a few moments, he pressed a hand to the paneling. With a slight creak, a portion of the wainscot gave way. Behind it lay a hollow niche, and in it, something wrapped in silk and sealed with wax. Holmes reached in and withdrew the bundle. Carefully unwrapping it, he revealed a thin leather-bound journal, edges darkened with age. Lord Alderley, who had joined us moments before, gasped. That looks like Evelyn's handwriting. Holmes opened it gently. The pages were filled with small, tight script. He turned to a bookmarked section. This may well explain much. He read silently for several minutes, his face impassive. Then, finally, he looked up. Lord Alderley, did you ever suspect your father's second marriage might not have been legally sanctioned? The old man's eyes widened. What are you saying? Lady Evelyn writes here in great distress. She claims that your father, in his grief and madness, fabricated a marriage with a woman named Caroline Harrow, Margaret's grandmother, but that no official record was ever kept. In fact, she believed Caroline may have been a nurse, brought to the estate to care for your ailing father, and retained under questionable circumstances. Lord Alderley staggered slightly, grasping the frame of the portrait for support. Watson stepped in. If Evelyn's account is accurate, then Margaret may not be legally entitled to the Alderley name. Holmes finished grimly, nor to the inheritance. Silence settled again. But why would Ellison care? I asked. He was no blood relative. Because, Holmes said, he was in love with Caroline Harrow. His name appears twice in the journal, as a young man, then again in later entries. He likely discovered this journal some years ago, perhaps when moving the portrait for cleaning or maintenance. He knew the truth. He wanted to ensure Margaret's claim was never secured. Holmes looked at Lord Alderley. Your steward may have spent a lifetime serving your family, but it appears his loyalty lay elsewhere. We spent the remainder of the day cross-referencing the dates and names in the journal. A brief search of local parish records, carried out by Holmes's contacts in London, confirmed the critical detail. No record of marriage existed between Lord Edwin Alderley and Caroline Harrow. Only a birth certificate listed Margaret's mother as Caroline H., with no father's name provided. That evening, Margaret sat quietly with Holmes in the conservatory. Her face was pale but calm. It doesn't change how I feel about this house, she said softly. But it changes how this house sees me. Holmes nodded. And what will you do? I don't know. Perhaps I'll start with being simply Margaret. Holmes offered the faintest of smiles. Titles are merely ink on paper, but character that is written in fire. Chapter 6. The whisper behind the mirror. The following morning arrived beneath a dull and oppressive sky, the air thick with a stillness that felt unnatural. Rain had fallen during the night, and a thin mist now clung to the grounds of Grimsby Hall, like a breath held too long. At breakfast, the conversation was stilted, each clink of silverware a brittle intrusion into the silence. Lady Wilhelmina sat at the head of the table, her manner composed but her complexion drawn. Mr. Aldous merely sipped at his tea, avoiding all eyes, while Clarissa toyed with her eggs without ever lifting her fork. Holmes, always an early riser, when the scent of mystery was in the air, consumed little and spent most of the meal absently staring out the window, as if listening to something beyond the reach of human hearing. After we had eaten, he rose and turned to me. Watson, he said, quietly but decisively, we must revisit the East Wing. There's a presence in that corridor that continues to whisper truths the living will not tell us aloud. I nodded, sensing his mood. Holmes, when in the thick of a puzzle, became attuned to the faintest signs, a shift in tone, a tremor in speech, the shape of dust disturbed where it should have lain still. This case had disturbed him more than he let on. The eastern corridor of Grimsby Hall was dim even by day, the curtains drawn as if in mourning. Cobwebs glimmered faintly in the corners of high moldings, and the air bore the chill of disuse. As we passed the heavy oak door to the late Lady Margaret's room, Holmes halted, one hand resting on the brass handle. "The room remains undisturbed," he murmured. "By request, no doubt, but whose? Lady Wilhelmina's? Or someone more cautious still?" He pushed open the door gently, and we stepped inside once more. The chamber had not changed. The fire was dead in the hearth, and the air was heavy with the scent of old flowers and faded perfume. The portrait still dominated the wall, its subject's painted eyes seeming more hollow than before, as if something vital had drained from them in the night. Holmes crossed the room and stood by the window, running a gloved hand along the frame. Still locked from the inside. And these panes fragile, yes, but unbroken. If any entered here on the night Lady Margaret died, they did not come this way. I was drawn once more to the fireplace, where blackened scraps of parchment still nestled in the grate. Holmes joined me and, producing his magnifying lens, crouched to examine them. These were letters, burned in haste. The edges are uneven torn and thrown into the flames without order. Note this residue red wax, partially melted. See the impression? It's faint, but possibly a crest. The seal was deliberately broken before burning, which suggests the writer was someone of importance. Could it be her brother's correspondence? I asked. Possibly. But these ashes suggest urgency, panic even. That does not align with letters from a trusted sibling. He paused, or perhaps from someone threatening to expose something. Holmes's gaze moved again to the large portrait hanging above the chaise. Without hesitation, he retrieved his walking cane from the corner and tapped each corner of the frame. A dull, hollow sound echoed faintly with each strike. Interesting. The canvas is mounted on a deeper frame than necessary. Hollow perhaps meant to conceal. With care, Holmes lifted the portrait from its wall hooks and laid it face down. Across the velvet chaise, I could see the meticulousness in his every motion. There was something sacred to Holmes about handling the past. From beneath the canvas, he peeled back a narrow segment of the backing and produced a folded parchment envelope. The red wax seal upon it was intact. "Curious," Holmes murmured. "An M or is it a U? The mark is intentionally ambiguous." He broke the seal and unfolded the note with great delicacy. His eyes moved quickly across the page before he read aloud. "You are not safe. The mirror has been turned, but he still sees. If you speak of what you heard in the conservatory, the bargain will be broken. You remember what he promised: eternal silence should you disobey." The note bore no signature, only a dark smear near the bottom, which Holmes touched lightly with his glove. Ash or soot, perhaps. A mark left by design. "The mirror," I said, "but I saw none in here before." With a sudden shift of energy, Holmes strode to a curtained alcove near the far wall. Drawing back the drapery, he revealed a tall mirror in an ornate gilt frame, half shrouded by a dark velvet cloth. "Concealed," he said softly. "Why conceal a mirror? Unless its reflection was feared." The mirror was peculiar. Its surface, when he pulled aside the cloth, did not merely reflect the room, it seemed to deepen it, as though some corridor of memory or nightmare lurked just beyond the glass. Holmes examined the frame closely, tapping gently at its base, until a quiet click sounded. A compartment opened at the bottom edge, revealing a small leather-bound diary. He held it aloft like a relic. "Watson, I believe we are now approaching the precipice." The diary's pages were fragile with age and use. Many entries had been torn out or scribbled over, but several remained intact. Holmes turned them delicately, reading in near silence before speaking. March 3rd. The cries again. From the east corridor. But when I rise, the hall is empty. Are they memories or warnings? March 12th. The portrait feels alive. I no longer sleep facing it. Something in her eyes, no, in his eyes behind it, haunts me. March 22nd. I told Wilhelmina I would speak to Father Glaive. She grew pale. Said it would be unwise. Best let sleeping sins lie, she said. What does she fear? March 30th. Heard the whisper behind the mirror. I dare not move it again. Holmes looked up, his face thoughtful. Father Glaive, the vicar we've yet to meet. This is the second time he is mentioned, first by the servants, now here. Shall I send for him? I asked. No, Holmes said firmly. We shall go to him before someone else does. Just then, there came a knock at the door. We turned sharply as it creaked open. Lady Wilhelmina stood in the doorway, dressed in a gray morning gown, her hands clasped tightly at her waist. I thought I heard voices, she said softly. Is it safe to be in here? Holmes studied her closely. Safe enough for those with nothing to hide. Her eyes flicked toward the portrait, now resting on the chaise, then the uncovered mirror. I only wanted to be sure the room hadn't been altered. You seem very concerned about that, Holmes said, his tone neutral. Lady Margaret was private. She valued her space, her dignity. Wilhelmina's voice wavered, just slightly. I merely wished her final wishes respected. Holmes nodded slowly. Of course. We are merely observing. Nothing has been removed. She lingered a moment longer, then withdrew, closing the door quietly behind her. Holmes turned to me. Does she strike you, Watson, as a daughter consumed by grief? No, I replied with honesty. More like a woman watching shadows to see if they move. Holmes tucked the diary carefully into his coat. Then we must follow those shadows to the vicarage. I believe Father Glaive may hold the key to what really frightened Lady Margaret. We left the room in silence, the mirror now fully uncovered. Behind us, and as we stepped into the hall, I could not help but glance back, just once. For a heartbeat, I would have sworn the painted eyes in the portrait had shifted, gazing not at the room, but at the mirror across from it. Chapter 7. The Vicar's Lantern, the village of Dunmere, where Grimsby Hall loomed like a brooding sentinel, had but one church, a modest, ivy-choked structure with a weather-worn spire and headstones leaning drunkenly in the churchyard like tired old men. The vicarage stood just beyond the church grounds, a red-bricked building, half-sunken by time and flanked by a gnarled beech tree that scraped at its windows when the wind blew. Holmes and I set off toward it after leaving the east wing. Holmes, deep in thought, one hand in his coat pocket, the other absently fingering the diary taken from behind the mirror. The mist had lifted somewhat, but the day remained gray, as if the sky were reluctant to reveal its secrets just as the house had been. Have you noticed? Holmes said, as we passed the rusted iron gate leading to the vicarage, how Wilhelmina reacts not to the notion of Margaret's suffering, but to the objects she left behind? The portrait, the mirror, the diary each seems to tighten her composure by degrees. You suspect she tampered with them? No, Holmes said softly. I suspect she feared them. We reached the vicarage gate, which groaned open on unsteady hinges. Holmes tapped the brass knocker against the age-darkened door. After a long moment, the door creaked open, revealing a man of about 60 tall, slightly stooped, with watery blue eyes behind thick spectacles. His clerical collar was stained faintly with ink, and the scent of candle wax and old parchment wafted from the interior behind him. Yes? The man asked with a voice like creased vellum. Reverend Glaive, I presume? Holmes said. I am he, Sherlock Holmes, he said simply. And this is Dr. Watson. We've come regarding Lady Margaret Grimsby. The vicar blinked. A pause stretched between us, awkward but telling. Then, stepping back, He motioned us inward. "Of course," he said slowly. "Please come in. But I warn you, what little I know may be of no comfort." Inside, the vicarage was dim and full of shadows, the heavy curtains drawn against the gray day. A single oil lamp burned on the sideboard, throwing golden light across a table stacked with books, inkpots, and a well-used Bible. The sitting room's air was heavy with pipe smoke and age, but there was a strange peace to the place, like a retreat from louder sins. "I understand you officiated Lady Margaret's funeral," Holmes said as we sat. "Yes," Father Glaive replied. "Though I was not asked to speak, it was a private affair. Unusual for someone of her status." "Had you known her well?" "Not intimately," he said, with a regretful smile. "Lady Margaret was devout, but distant. I saw her often in the chapel, but rarely spoke with her. She confided little, though there was one occasion, some weeks before her death, that troubled me." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Please go on." The vicar sighed and steepled his fingers. "She came to me in the late evening. It was raining, I recall. Her gloves were damp, and she seemed disturbed. Not frightened in the conventional sense, but shaken. She asked if sanctification extended to objects, if the soul could imprint itself onto things. Haunted? I said before I could stop. Myself. Father Glaive gave a faint shrug. I would not put it so plainly, Doctor. But yes, I believe she feared some object in the house held power over her, or perhaps, more accurately, over the memory of something she wished to forget. Holmes's eyes glittered. Did she mention what it was? No, only that it was kept in her room. She said, "He still sees me through it." "The mirror," I said, remembering the diary's cryptic entries. Father Glaive turned slowly to me. "Yes," he said, "I believe that was the implication. She told me she had tried to cover it, that it was once her father's. She said ... It had watched too much." A long silence followed. Holmes broke it, his tone quiet. "What do you know of the late Lord Grimsby?" The vicar hesitated. "Not much, I'm afraid. He died before my time in Dunmire. But the village remembers. A proud man, they say, difficult, believed in discipline, believed in appearances." Holmes nodded faintly. "And was there anything unusual about his death?" "No official record of scandal," Glaive said, standing and moving to a shelf. "But I have the burial records. Would you care to see?" Holmes gestured for him to proceed. The vicar pulled a worn ledger from the shelf and opened it on the table. Holmes stood and moved beside him. I rose too, peering over their shoulders as he flipped through the years. "There," Glaive said, pointing. "Lord Nathaniel Grimsby. Deceased, April 17th, 1892. Cause of death listed as cardiac arrest. Interred in the family crypt." Holmes studied the entry. "No mention of a physician?" "No," Glaive said. "At the time, the family kept their own medical staff. The record says he was found in his study, slumped in his chair. No inquest was requested." "Convenient," Holmes murmured. He turned away, then back again. "One last question, Reverend. Do you know anything of a sealed envelope, a letter of warning, or perhaps blackmail?" Glaive's eyes narrowed. "No, I cannot say that I do." Holmes gave a polite nod, but I could tell he did not believe the man entirely. We thanked him and took our leave, stepping out once more into the churchyard. The mist had thinned, and patches of the sun fought through the clouds, casting long shadows across the gravestones. Holmes paused near the wrought iron gate, eyes fixed on the church's weathered tower. "He knew more," Holmes said quietly. "Why hide it?" "Because whatever Margaret feared didn't die with her," Holmes replied. "It lingers attached to memory, to guilt, to legacy, and it has long arms, Watson. Arms that reach into the living." We made our way back toward the hall in silence, both of us aware that the ground beneath our feet had grown darker, as if the secrets of Grimsby were stirring, inching toward the surface. As we approached the gates of the estate, a figure broke. From the trees to the east, young Clarissa, breathless, shawl flying behind her. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson." She called, her voice urgent. We rushed to meet her. "It's Lady Wilhelmina," she gasped. "She's collapsed in the drawing room, and something's missing from the study, something she said must never be found." Holmes's expression darkened, his stride lengthening. "We're out of time, Watson," he muttered. Chapter 8. The secret behind the hearth. Clarissa's hurried steps echoed beside ours as we hastened through the gravel drive and under the stone archway of Grimsby Hall. Her cheeks were flushed with exertion, though her breathless urgency betrayed more than simple worry. There was fear in her eyes, raw and unmistakable. She was reading something in the study, she panted, clutching her shawl. A letter she kept muttering about the hearth. And then she collapsed. I didn't know what to do but fetch you. Inside, the drawing room was dim, the heavy velvet curtains drawn once again. Lady Wilhelmina lay on the chaise, a folded blanket beneath her head and a damp cloth on her brow. Beside her, Mrs. Little, the housekeeper, wrung her hands with helpless concern. "She's not quite unconscious," the woman said in hushed tones as we entered, "but her pulse is faint, and she has not spoken a word since I found her there, breathing oddly." Something frightened her dreadfully. Holmes moved swiftly to kneel at Wilhelmina's side, his long fingers deft as he examined her pulse, eyes flicking from her expression to the room. I did the same, noting the pallor of her skin and the shallow rise and fall of her chest. Whatever had shaken her had done so profoundly. "Where's the letter?" Holmes asked Clarissa quietly. I don't know," she admitted. "She was reading it when I brought her tea. When I returned, she had collapsed, and the paper was gone." Holmes stood abruptly. "Take care of her, Watson. Keep her warm. She's in a state of shock. Physical trauma is unlikely unless it lingers." I knelt by Lady Wilhelmina, checking her breathing as Holmes swept from the drawing room with the energy of a man following a scent. Clarissa, unsure, hovered by the threshold. What did she say about the hearth? Holmes asked, pausing in the hall. She kept saying, "He's still here. Behind the fire, watching, single quote." Then she whispered, "The ashes are not cold." Holmes's eyes flared. In less than a minute, we were in the study, the same room we had visited earlier. Holmes moved with quiet intensity, scanning the walls and the hearth that sat grandly in the center of the east wall. Above it, a portrait of Lord Grimsby presided. Over the room with a frown carved into oil. The fire had long since died, and only gray ash and blackened embers remained. Holmes knelt by the hearth. "There are secrets that prefer silence," he murmured. "But this one speaks through the walls." He reached into the ash with his gloved hand and felt along the stonework behind the grate. I watched him closely as his fingers paused, then curled into a crevice. With a click that was barely audible, a narrow slab of the hearthstone moved inward. "A false panel," I whispered. Holmes pulled back, and the hearthstone shifted outward, revealing a hidden compartment no larger than a shoebox. Inside, wrapped in decaying linen, lay a bundle of documents scorched at the edges, and a small rusted tin box with a broken lock. Holmes examined the documents carefully. These pages were scorched deliberately, but not destroyed. A clumsy attempt to conceal, not eliminate. He gently unwrapped the bundle. Several loose pages emerged handwritten, some in a woman's neat cursive, others in the shaky, aggressive script of a man. A few bore the crest of Grimsby Hall at the header. Holmes sifted through them silently, absorbing, scanning. Then he paused and handed me one. I read aloud, "To whom it may concern, should anything happen to me, I request this letter be brought into the light. My husband, Nathaniel Grimsby, has committed acts no man should be forgiven for. He watches even when unseen. I am not safe. Margaret is not safe. If you find this, know it was never a sickness of the mind. It was the house that refused to. Forget him. Signed, Anne Grimsby, March 1886. Anne Grimsby, I said aloud. That was Lord Grimsby's first wife. She died in 1887, Holmes murmured. Drowned in the lake, but this letter predates her death. He nodded grimly. It confirms what I suspected. Lord Grimsby's cruelty was not born of illness, it was calculated. He dominated his family through fear. The house itself became an instrument of that domination. He tapped another letter, this one torn and water-stained, but with unmistakable handwriting, the same seen in Margaret's diary. He locked me in the East Wing again. I tried to speak to Mama's portrait, but even she has turned away from me. The mirror sees him, I know it does. It remembers. The fire crackles, but it does not warm me. There are things beneath the floor, things buried with ashes and teeth. I wish I could forget. I wish he would stay dead. Margaret. A strange hush settled in the room. Grief does not make one hallucinate objects hidden behind fireplace stones. Holmes said, she was telling the truth, however dark it may be. From the rusted tin box, he lifted one final object, a brooch, simple and elegant, inlaid with the Grimsby family crest. The pin was bent, and the back bore a faint smear of dried blood. I believe this belonged to Anne Grimsby, Holmes said. It may be the brooch referenced in the rumors surrounding her death, that she lost it before she drowned. But why hide it? Because she didn't lose it, Holmes replied. She left it here, along with her letters, an archive of desperation, proof she meant to speak beyond the grave. We stood there, the weight of the hidden history pressing upon us. Every brick of Grimsby Hall seemed to groan with withheld truth. I need to speak with Lady Wilhelmina again, Holmes said. If she's recovered, she must tell us what she knows about this hearth, about Anne, and what really happened in this house. But before we could leave the study, Clarissa reappeared at the threshold, her face pale. She's awake, she said quietly. But she's strange. She keeps whispering about shadows in the East Wing. And she asked for you, Mr. Holmes. She said it's time you saw what he left behind in the attic. Holmes and I exchanged a glance. The attic. Come, Watson, Holmes said gravely. It appears we have one more floor to ascend, and perhaps finally, one ghost to put to rest. Chapter 9. Shadows beneath the rafters, the stairs to the attic of Grimsby Hall were steep and narrow, winding up past layers of dust and neglect. The upper floors had a different feel entirely from the rooms below, colder, more brittle, as though time itself had thinned and cracked the walls. Even the air tasted different, tinged with something metallic and faintly mildew-sweet. Clarissa led the way with a lantern, her hand trembling slightly as she paused before the final door at the top of the staircase. She's never allowed anyone up here, Clarissa whispered, her eyes darting down the dark corridor behind us. Not since Lord Grimsby died. The door has been bolted all these years. Who has the key? Holmes asked. I do, she said, her voice wavering. Lady Wilhelmina gave it to me just now. She said ... Clarissa hesitated. She said you'd understand what it meant once you saw what was inside. Holmes took the key and inserted it into the heavy brass lock. With a reluctant click, the mechanism turned, and the door creaked inward, revealing a long, low ceiling. Space that sprawled beneath the gabled roof of the manor. Dust hung in shafts of silver light streaming through the slit windows, illuminating broken furniture, shrouded trunks, stacks of old books, and faded portraits propped like sentries along the wall. We stepped inside, our footsteps muffled by the layer of dust. Clarissa remained at the threshold, unwilling to cross into the gloom. Holmes paused immediately, his keen gaze sweeping the space. There's been recent disturbance, he murmured. Someone's been in here, within the past few days. I followed his gaze. There were footprints in the dust. Small, fine tracks like those of a woman's shoe, leading around a collapsed armchair and ending at a large, covered object in the far corner. Holmes approached cautiously, drawing back. the dust sheet to reveal a full-length cheval mirror. Its frame was ornate, its surface streaked with age and time, but the mirror itself was intact. "The mirror again," I said softly. "The one Margaret mentioned?" Holmes nodded, crouching to examine the base. "This is no ordinary looking glass. There are carvings, Latin inscriptions. Here memoria tenet umbras. Memory holds the shadows," I translated. "Exactly. Mirrors were once believed to trap not just reflections, but echoes of emotion, even fragments of the soul." Holmes stood slowly. Margaret believed this mirror saw things, that it remembered what had been done within these walls. "And you?" I asked. Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he moved to a chest nearby and carefully lifted the lid. Inside lay a collection of yellowed papers, diaries, and one thin volume bound in green velvet. The name embossed on the cover was faded but legible. Margaret Grimsby. He opened it, turning pages slowly. The entries within were haunting in their clarity, descriptions of long nights, fearful whispers, strange creaks in the hallway, and most disturbingly, dreams of her father speaking through the walls, telling her she could never leave the house, that she belonged to it now. She was unraveling. I murmured. "Or," Holmes said softly, "she was being driven to unravel. Listen to this." He watches from the rafters now. Even in sleep, I hear him creaking above. The boards groan like he is walking, though no feet move. Mother said not to look in the mirror after sunset, but I did. I saw him there, not behind me, but inside the glass, smiling, though he's been dead for months. Holmes closed the book. "The signs of psychological torment are clear," he said, "but whether they came from within or were inflicted externally remains the greater question." At that moment, a sound broke the silence. A soft thump behind the wall to our right. Both Holmes and I froze. The noise came again, more distinctly this time. A dragging, scraping sound, as if something heavy were being pulled slowly across the floor beyond the lath and plaster. "There's no room behind that wall," I said. "The roof ends there." "There is a gap," Holmes replied. "Some attic spaces extend into false crawl spaces used for insulation or even hiding contraband. Help me move this panel." We shifted an old wardrobe aside. Behind it, barely visible beneath hanging cobwebs, was a small access door cut into the wall itself, cleverly disguised beneath painted wood panels. Holmes bent low and forced the latch open with a grunt. The door creaked inward, revealing a narrow, pitch-black passage. The air that exhaled from it was frigid. Holmes lit his lantern and crawled inside, and I followed close behind, the ceiling pressing low over our heads. The narrow crawl space curved around slightly, ending in a chamber scarcely large enough to kneel within. And there, at the center, lay a small iron cot, its mattress torn, stained, and sunken in the middle. Rusted chains dangled from its side. A set of worn children's shoes lay beneath it. The walls had been scratched, hundreds of overlapping gouges etched into the plaster like desperate writing, and beside the cot, resting atop a cracked porcelain doll, lay a tattered photograph. A young girl, her smile tentative, stood beside a tall man in a smoking jacket. Her expression was frozen and uneasy. Holmes turned it over. A name was scrawled on the back: Margaret and Father, 1885. So this was where she was kept. I whispered. Holmes nodded grimly. Isolated, hidden from view. This was not a punishment, it was systematic control. The perfect tool for manipulation, solitude, darkness, and fear. He lifted a brittle envelope tucked into the cot's frame. The seal had long since dried and cracked, but the writing remained intact. "To the one who finds this, you may think me mad, but it is this house that is mad. Not I. I was made prisoner here, not by walls, but by love twisted into terror. If I do not escape, I leave this as truth. He is not gone. He never left. His shadow walks in the cracks of this house. I hear him whisper through the bricks. Beware the mirror. It remembers. Margaret Holmes rose slowly, the letter in hand. This is not merely a domestic tragedy. It is a legacy of deliberate psychological torment. Margaret was telling the truth every fevered line. We exited the crawl space in silence, the photograph and letter clutched carefully by Holmes. As we stepped back into the attic proper, Clarissa's voice reached us from the stairwell. "Mr. Holmes, come quickly. Lady Wilhelmina's asking for you again. She says she remembers something. Something about the bells in the garden." Holmes's eyes darkened. The mystery shifts again. And with that, we descended the stairs, leaving behind the shadows beneath the rafters, but carrying their truths into the daylight. Chapter 10. The Garden of Forgotten. Bells. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the gardens of Grimsby Hall, gilding the ivy-choked hedgerows and tangling the gravel paths in golden light. It was a strangely peaceful hour, the kind that might lull one into forgetting the sorrow nestled within the walls of the great estate. But peace, as Holmes had often remarked, is a facade easily fractured by truth. And now, truth beckoned from the strangest of places, a forgotten bell tower at the edge of the garden. We had returned from the attic shaken but determined. Clarissa had led us swiftly to Lady Wilhelmina's sitting room, where the old woman waited in her armchair near the windows that overlooked the gardens. She was calm, far calmer than we'd seen her before, but her eyes were damp and distant, as though she had just woken from a long and restless dream. "You said you remembered something," Holmes prompted gently, settling beside her. "Yes," she whispered, fingers folded tightly around the handle of her walking cane. "I wasn't sure before, but the bells. There was something about the bells that night, the night Margaret vanished." "What bells, my lady?" "The garden bells. In the tower at the southern edge, by the yew trees. No one has rung them in decades. They're cracked and rusted. My late husband sealed them after the war. But that night, out of voice trembled. I heard them. A single toll, at midnight." Holmes leaned forward. "You are certain?" She nodded. It was a low, mournful sound. "I thought it was a dream, but now now I know better." Holmes turned toward me. "Watson, do you recall what Margaret wrote in her journal?" He watches from the rafters now. "Even in sleep, I hear him creaking above ... and ... Yes, Mother said not to look in the mirror after sunset ... but I did. I saw him there, not behind me, but inside the glass." "There was more," Holmes added. "She spoke of bells tolling when the dead are near. A superstition, perhaps. But here it echoes again. I buried it for so long," Lady Wilhelmina murmured. "There was so much grief and fear. But something about your presence, Mr. Holmes, has stirred it all back up. The house feels unsettled again." "That's because it was never settled to begin with," Holmes said softly. "The truth was only buried, not resolved. We left her to rest and made our way to the far end of the grounds. The garden paths narrowed the further we walked, bordered by brambles and ancient hedgerows that had been left to grow wild. We passed stone benches choked with moss and marble cherubs half swallowed by ivy. At last we came to a rusted gate, nearly hidden by a drooping curtain of honeysuckle. Beyond it stood the old bell tower. The structure was narrow and steep, a red brick cylinder crowned by a conical slate roof, its bell loft barely visible through. The slats, a weathered cross, sat atop the spire, now tilted precariously. Vines had climbed halfway up the masonry, and at its base, a door hung slightly ajar. "I doubt anyone's entered this place in years," I remarked, brushing cobwebs from the frame. Holmes stepped inside without hesitation. The air within was musty and cool, laced with the bitter tang of rust. A spiral staircase wound its way upward, its iron rail twisted and corroded in places. At the base of the stairs sat an ancient rope frayed and dust-caked, its end tied to a cleat by the wall. Holmes inspected it closely. "There's wear on this," he noted. And not from decades ago. This was pulled recently. He held out the rope for me to touch, and sure enough, the fibers were rough but not brittle. Someone had disturbed it within the last few days. Let's ascend, he said. The climb was precarious. Each step groaned under our weight, and flakes of rust fell with every movement. But as we reached the upper landing, the view opened out to a wide panorama of the estate grounds, and before us, suspended in the shadows of the roof, hung the great bell itself. It was cracked clean through the middle. Holmes approached the beam from which it hung. A smaller rope, this one newer, had been tied to a separate iron ring. A mechanism had been rigged with a counterweight, a crude system that allowed the bell to be rung remotely. From below, he turned, his face grim. Someone wanted that bell to toll again. Not as a signal, but as a message. But to whom? I asked. For what purpose? Before he could answer, something shifted beneath the floorboards. A sharp creak, then another. We both stilled. Holmes motioned for silence, stepping slowly toward a hatch at the corner of the loft, an access panel leading to the eaves of the roof. He knelt and opened it. Inside was a small recess, barely 2 feet deep, lined with old timber and nesting straw. And hidden within, wrapped in burlap and tucked behind a beam, was a bundle of objects. Holmes pulled it free and laid it on the planks. The burlap fell away, revealing a brass-handled dagger, tarnished with age, a black and white photograph of Margaret Grimsby, standing beside the very bell tower we now occupied, and most curiously, a child's silver rattle engraved with the initials. And gee, it's as if someone meant for this to be found, I whispered. But why hide it here? Holmes's brow was furrowed. Because it connects the bell tower to Margaret directly. She was brought here, perhaps even kept here for a time. But no one saw her, I said. She was believed to have vanished into thin air. Holmes looked up at the rafters. Or perhaps they chose not to see. As we descended, Holmes grew increasingly silent, his mind evidently racing with connections and possibilities. The golden light had begun to fade, the gardens lengthening with evening shadow as we emerged once more into the open. Then Clarissa came running down the path, breathless and wide-eyed. Mr. Holmes, a letter just arrived addressed to you. But there's no name on the envelope. Just a symbol, a broken mirror drawn in ink. Holmes took the envelope with a gloved hand and examined the seal. It was wax, but the impression was unmistakable. A tiny, jagged crack running through a circle. He tore it open and unfolded the note. The message was short, written in a tight, precise script. The mirror was only the beginning. She left more than shadows behind. If you wish to find the truth, return to where she last stood before the fire. Midnight awaits. Holmes folded the letter without expression and turned to me. We returned to the drawing room tonight. Watson, he said, and we watched the mirror. For Margaret was not merely a victim, she may yet be the key to the entire mystery.